You can never overestimate the importance of a boss fight in a video game. In a short enclosed period of time, you're showing off the best that your game has to offer, and if you throw up something appalling, it just isn't gonna wash well. Video games, for as long as they've had them, have lived and died by their boss fights. When done right, it can easily be a hugely memorable and satisfying highlight within the game, a moment that tops off a section or a game in general. But when they're not handled with the right amount of care and basic intelligence sometimes, there's infinite scope for them to go wrong. And this is more than bosses just being hard to overcome. This is the absence of the kind of balancing and clever tricks that are so helpful for climactic showdowns. Sometimes you get the sense that story is overriding gameplay a little, or that a boss fight was forced into a situation where it didn't need one, but either way, they can be torturous experiences sometimes. And not in a fun way. Hard boss fights can be fun sometimes. If there was ever a series that really got the hang of making boss fights, it'll be Metal Gear. They were weird, they were wonderful, and they were very rarely boring or substandard. And yet every family, most families, have a black sheep of some sort, and Metal Gear Solid 4 definitely had an approach of, gameplay? What's that? In short, Raging Raven can fuck right off. This is going to sound a little odd, but this game's biggest problem is the fact that MGS4 was a PS3 exclusive. Not saying it would have been better on the 360, but you trade out a control stick for a mouse and you solve half the problems here. Raging Raven is so fast and twitchy that it becomes a real exercise to track her movements, even more so when there's half a dozen decoys to deal with, and the way your viewpoint just pans over with a control stick is way too slow for that. Should you leave the central area and try to get a better view of Raging Raven, you find yourself incredibly exposed, and considering you're now closer to this fast-moving enemy, it's even harder to hit her. But maybe the biggest fault is that there's no trick to it. No clever way of doing loads of damage like other bosses. It's just a depressingly generic action boss that suffers from dodgy controls. And it comes at the end of maybe the worst chapter in the game. Not a good mix, to be honest. When you've got a key plot point that structures most of your game's story, it's quite important that whatever you're building up to actually has some payout. Goes without saying really, letting your audience down is never going to end well. That's why I hope all of you watching at home go into these videos with as little optimism as possible. But considering the amount of excitement that was built up throughout your journey in Borderlands, the end result is a particularly strong letdown. The basic plot of the first Borderlands game is that there's this mystical vault that everyone wants to find and open, and you know, that's kind of it. It's quite a big part of the story. That's all you really need. So naturally, at the end of the game, you have a chance to open it, but what kind of bountiful rewards will be inside? Money? Knowledge? Crazy alien technology? It's not that exciting, really. You know, I get that you need a final challenge to your game, and in theory, having the Destroyer show up at the end of Borderlands isn't immediately a terrible idea, but it doesn't take long to become one. We've got a wide selection of cliches on offer here, ranging from the villain getting killed just before the fight and a final boss that comes the fuck out of nowhere, to my personal favourite, the static bullet sponge boss that does very little other than sit in place and soak up your shots. And what's doubly disappointing is that this kind of mediocrity came from fucking Borderlands! You've got guns that shoot acid and this is the best you can do? Would have rather had a bunch of treasure myself. I like to think that I've got more patience for the cover system in shooter games than most people, or at least more so than this guy, and so when a game shows up that is mostly based around this mechanic, it doesn't bother me that much. Though I gotta say, the first Uncharted game pushed me very close to my limits. And then I got to the end and the final boss promptly pushed me beyond my limits. Not even sure you can call this a boss fight really, but there's gameplay here, I reckon it'll pass. This might as well be a demonstration of what the cover system is, because the first part isn't much more than what could easily be a tech demo for this kind of mechanic. Little more than a game of whack-a-mole frankly, but when you get to the end and face up with the big bad guy, his name is Navarro by the way, might have neglected to mention that, but to be honest the game doesn't talk about him much either, you get to this point and it's a QTE love fest. And come on Nate, he's clearly not down for the count, don't turn your back on him. How you survive 3 games of this, I'll never work out. You know, I feel like I should put a spoiler warning for the next one, but it comes from the world of Bioshock. I could explain the significance of the siren in Bioshock Infinite, but it'd take too long, and even if I did, I fear I'd miss something along the way. It's a complicated situation. But no, we're here for the boss fight, and considering that Bioshock Infinite didn't have too many, it's a shame more thought couldn't have been put into this one. This fucking thing won't sit still. I know ghosts have the ability to vanish, probably, but you gotta tone it down a little, otherwise we're gonna be here for a long time. The siren comes equipped with a talent for resurrecting enemies, which is a trait that's never ever been annoying in video games, only topped by her being able to heal herself. It's crazy the amount of damage she can do with that shrieking attack, and it never feels like any of your weapons are really all that effective against her. And as if this wasn't enough, you don't just fight her once and be done with it. You gotta do this a few times. Never gets more fun than this. Strap yourselves in, it's a bumpy road ahead. I didn't know a lot about the plot of the first Half-Life game when I played it, but I wasn't too taken aback when things go wrong and there's a bunch of aliens to deal with. What did strike me as odd is when you get teleported to another dimension and hit the bad guys where they live. At this stage it almost feels like a different game entirely. But whatever, let's just knock out the main bad guy and be done with it. No, sorry, I mean the main bad baby? A giant fetus? Okay. What? Oh, you know a boss is good if I need to look up the name of it beforehand. Apparently it's called Nihilanth, but who even cares at this stage? So fine, it's a boss that comes out of nowhere which also happens to be a giant baby, but that is not the problem. Or at least the main problem. There are far louder elephants in the room here. This arsehole launches teleporters at you, which starts off being kinda cool, but since they home in on you, that doesn't last long. The only way you can really defeat this thing is by hiding behind a rock and shooting away at these crystals, but you give me these weird trampolines and say that using them might get me killed? Don't you ruin my dreams now. Any games that are built around random chance have the potential for some moments to be really easy or really difficult, depending on how kind the game has been to you up until this point. But it depends on what makes the bosses tricky. If they're hard because they weren't built properly, you're in for a whole heap of trouble. You can get stupid powerful in the Binding of Isaac without too much problem, but while it may make some difficult bosses a cakewalk, it doesn't paper over the cracks in their design that often make them difficult bosses in the first place. All that means is that the times you fight these bosses when you aren't crazy overpowered are going to be an agonizing uphill struggle. Really is a case of picking your favourite flavour of poison with some of these bosses, but for now, we'll just go with the bloat. You know, this game likes to use bullet hell a lot, but with the bloat, a different but I guess equally effective stance was taken. Fill the screen with as much shit as possible. The bloat might not shoot too many intricate bullet patterns, but what he lacks in that department he makes up for with these stupid bouncy eyeballs. They even bounce off of each other just to make things even more interesting. So where's a safe place to stand against the bloat? Well, not in front or to either side, because Mr. Bloat has dual blood laser cannons to fuck you up. And even if you do end up behind him, he can jump in the air and join you at the top of the screen. So are there any safe zones? Not really. Pray you don't come up against two of them in one room. No god can save you now. RPG boss fights are always a delicate matter because you can easily screw them up. There's some natural progression to the difficulty in any game, but it matters more in games where leveling up is given so much importance. The act of grinding for levels can solve a few problems, but it isn't exactly something to be proud of. Neither is making a boss that is only really beatable when using one particular playstyle. Case in point, Lorithia from Xenoblade Chronicles. And I was having so much fun too. Lorithia is one almighty roadblock in this game. For most of your quest, you can get by with all your characters being slightly underleveled, but Lorithia is the one boss that really punishes you for this. Even worse, she punishes you for not using magic attacks as much. Her physical defense is based off the number of enemies that she summoned that are still alive, and the best way of getting rid of them? Ether attacks, or basically magic. So if you're like me and you steered clear of melee because ether attacks were too confusing, you've got to come out of this and do a legendary amount of grinding. Any boss that narrows your choice as much as this, frankly, isn't worth the effort. Repeating a section of your game is a sin that only gets worse if what you're repeating isn't actually all that good. I'm sure you can get some joy out of going over parts of a game that you really like, but shoving bad moments into your face over and over again? It's gonna wear very thin very quickly. And maybe if the imprisoned from Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword only showed up once, I would have probably been totally kind of annoyed at that first encounter. But nope, we've gotta fight it 3 times! Oh, mercy. Hey, at least the siren had an interesting design, that just being a wispy ghost thing. I look at the imprisoned and often think that the doors to Wind Waker haven't been closed properly. Why does it have squidgy toes? Why does it have a butthole in its mouth? When you're on ground level with this thing, the mere act of it walking is enough to send shockwaves out from its toes, which are kind of important if you want to get at the imprisoned's weak points. You can just drop down on it from above, but it often feels like the fight wasn't really designed for this. You slide off or get thrown off way too often. During the second time you come across it, the imprisoned grows arms, which only really serves as a means of making it more difficult for you to run around to hammer that ceiling spike back into its head. Why couldn't you give me Koloktos 2 more times? That fight was great! What I wouldn't give for one of those giant weapons right about now. You fight the imprisoned multiple times because the seal that is keeping it imprisoned keeps breaking, so the act of resealing it every time is meant to show off what a real tangible threat this beast is, but there's gotta be better ways of doing it, ones that don't involve me to be there every time. When the train comes off the tracks, it's likely that there isn't gonna be a damn thing that you can salvage from it once the dust settles. When you strip back the numbers in your development team and release a game that is nowhere near finished, it perhaps comes as no surprise when most of the bosses in it are complete crap. And yet there exists a concentrated pool of crap that even has the audacity to remind you that there is no salvation for you in these circumstances. Silver the Hedgehog, ladies and gentlemen. And yet, while this is a complete and utter train wreck of a boss fight, it really is to be expected of Sonic the Hedgehog 2006. Not to excuse the glitches or one of the most unhelpful cameras you'll ever come across, but at this point in time, something as unredeemable as this boss fight is merely part of the package with this game. Maybe if the silver fights were given more time, something passable would have come out from it, but you could apply that idea to the whole fucking game. At least it represents the game it comes from well. Is that a compliment? Probably the closest it'll ever come to getting one. If you've followed the endeavours of this channel for a while, you might remember that I've done a list like this before, though 2012 was 4 years ago, Jesus. There were a few pretty appalling bosses on there, but I also briefly mentioned the fight with the Joker at the end of Batman Arkham Asylum. Basically, he drinks this Titan formula and becomes this thing. I said some bad things about this boss 4 years ago, but looking back at it now, I was so lenient. This is one of the worst ideas I've ever seen implemented in a video game, and if this came from the same minds that use the Joker so well in the rest of Batman Arkham Asylum, then I'm very scared. What makes the Joker such a great villain is that he's the complete opposite to Batman in virtually every department. While he might be scrawny, he's got enough cunning and guile to outsmart Batman, and Batman is no slouch. In a head-to-head fist fight, Batman wins every time, as showcased very aptly in the rest of the games in the series. Pumping him full of magic liquid tramples over all of the Joker's qualities and simply turns him into another giant muscle man. And yet, it gets worse. The actual fight against this monstrosity falls foul of so many problems that other fights on here suffer from. You want to fight waves of lesser enemies? Oh, that sounds wonderful! How about moments where you simply can't damage this thing? Yep, got you covered on that one. Have you been neglecting your A button recently? How about you spam the shit out of it in what really felt like the final nail in this battle's coffin? This isn't just a boss fight done badly, this is a horrendous concept done badly. This has been Rabbidluigi, and if I was to think of the worst possible thing I could do to the Joker in order to make him a final boss of a Batman game, making him this giant hulking behemoth, it wouldn't even cross my mind. I like to think that the people in charge of thinking up designs for this boss, they would know better. But hey, since the Joker is such a specialist in psychological torture, at least they got that bit right. Hello guys, thank you for watching. If I had enough foresight and prior planning, what I could have done is made this video about Easter eggs, because around the world, wherever they celebrated it, is Easter Sunday today, the day this video goes up. But in order to do that, I would have to keep track of Easter, and Easter is a slippery motherfucker. It just moves all over the place. How the hell do you keep track of it? It's confusing. But there is something next week that is slightly easier to see coming, and that is April Fool's. April Fool's Day is on a Friday, so you may get a countdown, or at the very least a video from me, but you're unlikely to get another one on Sunday as well. Haven't quite got to the stage yet where I can make 2 countdowns in a week. Imagine the day when I can do that, then I can rule the world!